The winter wind screamed through the empty mining town of Silver Creek, sweeping snow across its deserted streets like restless ghosts. Eleanor Matthews stood on the wooden porch of the general store, her hands shaking around a crumpled letter. The shopkeeper's words still rang in her ears. Her husband, James Matthews, had run off with another woman, leaving her penniless in the Colorado mountains with nothing but that letter and the clothes on her back. The snow bit through her thin coat, stinging her cheeks as she stepped into the street. 6 months ago, she had arrived here as a newlywed from Boston, full of hope. Now the townsfolk whispered behind her back, pretending pity while watching her fall. The boarding house had already told her to leave by nightfall if she couldn't pay. Her money was gone, and the storm clouds rolling down from the peaks promised a deadly night. Eleanor's boots sank into the half-frozen mud as she walked aimlessly toward the saloon. Its yellow light glowed like temptation through the snow, the laughter of men spilling out onto the street. She had never set foot inside one in her life, but hunger and cold made the unthinkable start to feel possible. Before she reached the doors, a shadow moved from between two buildings. A tall figure stepped out, blocking her path. He was wrapped in furs, his beard thick and wild, his presence so powerful she felt it before she fully saw him. Ezra Stone. Every soul in Silver Creek knew that name. The mountain man who lived alone deep in the Rockies. Some said he'd once been a doctor back east before the war. Others whispered he'd gone mad after losing his family. But all agreed he was dangerous, a man who kept to himself and trusted no one. "Heard your man left you," his deep voice rumbled, calm and steady like distant thunder. Eleanor stiffened, clutching her coat tighter. "My situation is none of your concern, Mr. Stone." He didn't move, didn't raise his voice, just watched her with eyes that seemed to see everything. "Winter's coming early this year," he said, glancing toward the mountains. "A woman alone out here won't last a month." Quote. The truth in his words hit harder than the wind. She wanted to argue, to tell him she would manage somehow, but the lump in her throat betrayed her fear. "I have a proposition," Ezra said finally. His breath steamed in the freezing air. "I need sons, heirs to pass my land to. You need a way to survive the winter. I'll give you food, shelter, protection. In return, you give me what I ask." Eleanor's heart thudded painfully. She understood him at once. "You can't mean." "Your body," he said plainly. "For my protection, you give me sons, and I'll make sure you never freeze or starve again." She felt the world tilt around her. It was obscene, it was cruel, and yet her mind saw only the alternative, dying alone in the snow before sunrise. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Then you walk away," he said with a shrug. "But the storm will take you before morning." Snowflakes landed on her lashes, melting into cold tears she refused to shed. All her life she'd been told what was proper, what was decent. But the mountains didn't care about Boston manners. They cared only about survival. "How do I know you won't hurt me?" she whispered. "They say men like you lose their minds up there." Ezra's blue eyes softened, just for a moment. "I was a doctor once," he said quietly. "Took an oath to do no harm. I still live by it." The words cut through her fear like light through fog. For the first time since the letter, she felt the faint stirrings of something that wasn't despair, hope, maybe, or defiance. "1 year," she said suddenly. "You'll have 1 year to get your sons. Then I'm free to leave, with enough to make my own way." A flicker of respect crossed his face. 1 year, he agreed. Starting now. His large hand reached out. Hesitating only a moment, she placed hers in his. His grip was strong but not cruel. Their bargain was sealed. By dawn, she was sitting beside him on his wagon as they left Silver Creek behind. The storm had turned the world white, the horses laboring through deep snow. The only sound was the creak of wood and the hiss of wind. Ezra drove without speaking, his face set, his movements sure. Eleanor stole glances at him. The hard lines of his jaw, the scar above his brow, the steadiness in his eyes. He looked like a man carved from the mountains themselves. "How far is your home?" she asked at last, her voice small in the vast silence. "3 days in good weather," he replied. "5 in this." She nodded, pretending she wasn't afraid. They reached a small trapper's cabin by nightfall, a single-room shelter against a cliff. Ezra built a fire and melted snow for coffee while she stood awkwardly by the door. "You take the bed," he said, nodding toward the pile of furs in the corner. "I'll sleep by the fire. Tonight, we just survive the cold." Relief swept through her, so sharp it hurt. She nodded, wrapping herself in the heavy blanket he handed her. As the flames danced across the rough-hewn walls, she lay listening to the wind and the steady rhythm of Ezra's breathing. The storm howled outside, but inside the small cabin, she felt, if not safe, then something close to it. She stared into the fire until her eyes burned, the words of their bargain echoing in her mind. "Your body for my protection." 1 year. It was a deal with the devil, or maybe with salvation itself. And as the night deepened, Eleanor Matthews realized that her fate was no longer her own. When dawn broke, the storm still roared across the mountains, turning the world outside into a wall of white. Ezra stood at the small window, his broad shoulders blocking the weak light that seeped through the frost. "We stay put today," he said. "Traveling in this will kill the horses, and maybe us too." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the excuse not to face the wilderness again so soon. The cabin was small but solid, built of thick logs and smelling faintly of smoke and pine. Ezra moved with quiet purpose, feeding the fire, checking supplies, making everything orderly in a way that surprised her. She sat near the flames, watching him. He was a man built for survival, every movement precise, efficient, and yet beneath the roughness, there was something different, discipline, maybe even gentleness. When he finally sat across from her with a tin cup of coffee, she noticed the book he pulled from his pack. The sight startled her. It was a medical text, old and worn from years of use. "You really were a doctor," she said quietly. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Once." "What made you leave it behind?" For a long moment he didn't answer. The only sound was the wind shrieking through the cracks of the door. Finally, his deep voice filled the silence. "The war. I tried to save men who couldn't be saved. Saw more death than one man should. When it ended, I had nothing left worth staying for." She hesitated. "Your wife?" His eyes darkened like a gathering storm. "Sarah. And our son, Thomas. Fever took them both 5 years ago." The pain in his voice struck her harder than she expected. This man, who seemed carved from stone, carried wounds far deeper than any she could see. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He nodded once, his face unreadable. "You asked, and I answered. Let that be enough for now." The storm trapped them for 2 full days. In that time, an uneasy peace settled between them. Ezra taught her how to start a fire properly, how to melt snow for drinking water, how to use pine sap as a salve. Eleanor found herself watching the way his hands moved, steady, confident, as if even the wilderness obeyed him. When the skies finally cleared, the world outside had transformed. The snow sparkled like glass beneath the morning sun. Ezra packed their supplies in silence, and soon they were moving again, the wagon creaking up the narrow mountain trail. The air grew thinner, colder. Each breath burned Eleanor's lungs. But she didn't complain. Pride kept her upright beside him, even when her body begged for rest. By afternoon, the trail curved along a ridge that opened into a breathtaking view. Endless mountains stretched in every direction, their peaks lost in clouds. "There," Ezra said, pointing to a valley nestled between 3 towering peaks. "That's Stone Valley, my home." Eleanor leaned forward, awe pushing aside her fear. It was beautiful and wild, untouched by the world below. As they descended, she began to see signs of civilization. Fences buried under snow, a barn, smoke rising faintly in the distance. And then the cabin appeared, a large log house built against the cliffside, solid and welcoming in the late afternoon light. "You built this?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded once. "With my own hands." Inside, the cabin was nothing like she had expected. The floors were polished wood, the shelves lined with books, and animal pelts covered the walls. It was a home, not a hideout. "The bedroom's through there," Ezra said, nodding toward a small door. "You'll find women's clothes in the trunk. They should fit." Eleanor froze. "Women's clothes?" "Sarah's," he said simply. Then, without another word, he stepped back outside to tend the animals. Left alone, Eleanor opened the trunk. Inside lay dresses carefully folded, a hairbrush with strands of blonde hair still caught in the bristles, and a faded photograph of a woman holding a baby. She sat on the edge of the bed, her chest tight. These were the ghosts she had replaced. When Ezra returned hours later, the fire glowed warmly and the table was set. She had cooked a simple stew from the supplies she found, unsure if he'd even want her to. But he ate in silence, neither complimenting nor criticizing. Afterward, she gathered her courage. "What were their names?" she asked. "Your wife and child." His hand tightened around his cup. "Sarah and Thomas," he said, the words slow and careful. "They're buried up the ridge. Fever took them both, though I tried everything I knew." Eleanor lowered her gaze, her heart heavy with empathy. "That's why you live out here alone." He stared into the fire, his jaw set. Some things a man can't outrun, but he can make something new in their place. The next weeks passed quietly. Ezra taught her how to chop wood, how to cook with what they hunted, how to patch worn clothes. Slowly, she learned the rhythm of mountain life, the sound of wind through pine, the cry of an eagle overhead, the peace that came with exhaustion at sunset. But one question kept gnawing at her. Why hadn't he claimed what their bargain demanded? One night, while they sat before the fire, she finally asked, "You said I would give you sons. You haven't touched me. Why?" Ezra looked up from the book he was reading, his expression unreadable. "Because you still flinch when I walk into a room," he said. "I don't want frightened obedience from the mother of my children." His calm honesty struck her harder than anger ever could. She looked away, ashamed of the fear she hadn't realized she showed. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying snow and silence. Inside, a fragile understanding began to form between them. Days became weeks. The snow melted, revealing new life in the valley, streams running, green shoots pushing through frozen soil. Eleanor found herself growing stronger, more capable, her hands calloused from work, her mind sharper from survival. She began to see Ezra differently, not as the brute she'd feared, but as a man bound by ghosts and guilt, trying to rebuild from ruin. One morning, while checking rabbit traps together, they came across a wounded doe. Ezra lifted his rifle, but Eleanor stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered, kneeling beside the trembling animal. She spoke softly until it stilled, and only then did Ezra take the merciful shot. When it was over, he looked at her differently, something like respect, maybe even admiration, flickering in his eyes. "Sarah believed in mercy too," he said quietly. That night, for the first time, they talked like equals. She told him about Boston, her father's books, her dreams before James. He spoke of the war, of medicine, of the son he'd buried in frozen ground. By the time the fire burned to embers, Eleanor realized something had changed. She no longer saw him as a captor. She saw him as a man, trying to start again. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted to be part of that beginning. Spring came to Stone Valley like a promise kept. The snow thinned, the creek began to sing again, and patches of wildflowers appeared along the ridge. Eleanor had been in the mountains for nearly 6 months now, and the woman who once trembled in the cold streets of Silver Creek had changed. She was stronger, sun-kissed, and sure of herself in ways she had never been back in Boston. Ezra still rose before dawn, his day ruled by chores and the steady rhythm of the land, but the silence between them had softened. They shared meals now, laughter even. At night, they sat by the fire reading aloud from the books he kept, sometimes falling asleep in the chairs before the flames died. One evening, as the sunset spilled gold across the valley, Ezra spoke first. "It's been half a year since you came," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Our bargain still stands." Eleanor set down her mending. "I know." He turned toward her then, the light catching the lines in his weathered face. "I asked for sons because I thought legacy was all I had left. But these months have shown me something else. You've brought life into this place again, even before there's a child." Her throat tightened. "Then why haven't you taken what you came for?" Ezra's voice was low but steady. "Because I wanted you to choose it, not endure it." She rose slowly, heart pounding. "And if I say I'm ready?" Quote. He stood too, close enough that the warmth of him reached her through the cool evening air. "Then I take you not as payment, but as my wife in truth." The decision hung between them like a heartbeat. Then Eleanor reached for his hand. "I'm ready." That night, the mountain man who had once bargained for her body touched her as if she were made of light. There was no demand in him, only reverence. When he whispered her name, it was a prayer, not a claim. The storm of her first winter faded completely, leaving only quiet peace. Summer turned Stone Valley into a living painting, green pastures, clear water, and skies so wide they seemed to hold the world together. Ezra built irrigation channels, repaired the barn, and planted new crops. Eleanor tended the garden, gathered herbs, and sewed clothes for the colder months ahead. Their home no longer felt like a refuge born of desperation, but a place of belonging. Then, one warm evening in late August, as they watched the sun sink behind the peaks, Eleanor laid a trembling hand against her stomach. "Ezra," she said softly, "I think I'm with child." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached out, his large hand covering hers, his eyes shining with something unguarded and raw. "Are you sure?" Quote. She nodded. "I've missed 2 months now." He knelt before her, resting his palm gently against her belly. "Then may God watch over you both." His voice broke slightly. "I'll do the rest." Through autumn, he became even more protective, never letting her lift heavy buckets, checking her pulse and color each day, cooking when she was too tired to move. His old training as a doctor returned in full, and with it, the quiet fear he never said aloud, that the mountain might take from him again what he loved most. Eleanor saw it in his eyes every time he touched her, and she loved him all the more for it. When the first snow fell, he finished building a wooden cradle, smooth and perfect, polished with bear fat until it gleamed. She ran her hands over it and smiled. "You made this?" Quote. "I did," he said simply, "for our child." Quote. Winter sealed them in again, but this time the cabin was full of warmth. Ezra read to her by firelight, and she wrote in the leather journal he'd gifted her, recording each flutter and kick she felt. Sometimes he played his fiddle while she drifted to sleep, the soft music wrapping around them like a blanket. The baby came in early spring. Eleanor woke before dawn, pain gripping her in waves that made her gasp. Ezra was instantly at her side, calm and steady, years of training guiding his hands. The labor was long and hard, but he never left her, whispering quiet encouragement, wiping her brow, holding her hand when she thought she couldn't bear another moment. Then came a cry, sharp and strong, and suddenly it was over. Ezra held up their child, eyes glistening. "A son," he said, voice breaking. "You've given me a son." He laid the tiny boy in her arms, and she wept, joy mixing with exhaustion. "William," she whispered, "William Thomas Stone." Ezra repeated the name softly, his hand trembling as he touched the baby's cheek. "Welcome home, son." Quote. The months that followed were filled with the simple joys of new life, nights of restless crying, days of laughter, and a growing peace that neither had ever known before. Ezra spent hours carving small wooden animals for William while Eleanor sang softly as she worked. When summer came again, she sat on the porch watching Ezra lift their giggling son into the air, the child's laughter echoing off the mountains. She rested a hand on her belly, already rounding with another child. "Your sons will come into the world soon," she called out with a smile. Ezra looked up at her, his expression soft, almost disbelieving of his own happiness. "I asked for heirs," he said, crossing to her side, "but what I found was a family." She took his hand, pressing it to her stomach. "And I found a life worth living." As the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Ezra drew her close, their child between them. The mountains that had once seemed so cold now held the warmth of home. The bargain that began in desperation had become love freely chosen. And, in Stone Valley, beneath the wide Colorado sky, the mountain man who once growled his claim found something he'd never dared hope for: peace.